I have previously argued that Dominion by Tom Holland is one of the most important books of our time. Today we pick it up in chapter 6, entitled Heaven, AD 492. Holland takes us into the expansion of the dominion of Jesus Christ in the early Middle Ages. He describes the decline and death of paganism, a leftover from the Roman past. The Christians saw it as a victory over Satan. Holland turns his pen to Gregory the Great, the 7th century pope. In this context, he chronicles a radical new conception of time. This is one of the most important developments in human history. The ancients had believed history moved in cycles, but Christians had a linear view. History was a steady march onward and upward to the final judgment and coming of Christ and his millennial reign. This introduces into culture for the first time the powerful idea of progress. Even though Gregory looked out over the wreckage of what had once been the mighty Roman Empire, he still had hope as he looked to the future. Augustine wrote that those who lacked the Christian understanding of history, quote, were doomed to wander in a circuitous maze, finding neither entrance nor exit, end quote. Holland moves from Rome out to the very edge of the old Roman Empire to a savage, brutal, barbarian people, the Irish. Unlike any religion in history, Christianity has no permanent geographical center. What you might call the center of the Christian faith moves around. Now, for a very short time, it was Jerusalem, then the Eastern Mediterranean, then Rome, then Northern Europe, then North America, and now you could argue it's Africa or any number of places. The early medieval period is an example of this. Ireland was as far from the center of ancient culture as Jupiter. Holland introduces us to one of the greatest missionaries and one of the most influential people the world has ever known, Patrick. The Irish monasteries he established raised up some of the most aggressive and rigorous Christians that have ever existed, and they gave their attention to the lands east and south, what is modern-day England, France, Germany, even as far as Italy. Here we find a product of Patrick's legacy, a missionary named Columbanus, who also was enormously influential. Holland says of Columbanus, quote, schooled in the ferociously exacting monasticism of his native land, Columbanus appeared to the Franks a figure of awesome and even terrifying holiness. The impact of the Irish monks is incalculable. Thomas Cahill is a respected historian. His famous book, How the Irish Saved Western Civilization, could easily have been entitled, How Irish Monks Saved Western Civilization. Or better yet, How St. Patrick Saved Western Civilization. Without men like Patrick and Columbanus, the modern world as we know it would not exist. Jesus Christ enters the hearts of men and women in every generation and uses them in the ongoing transformation of life on earth. In future chapters of Dominion, we see this power continue to unfold. Chapter 7, Exodus, AD 632. We move now into the world of late antiquity, a phrase coined by historian Peter Brown. There arose the greatest threat Christian kingdoms would ever face, Islam. Quote, provinces of the battle-wearied Roman and Persian empires, like overcooked meat slipping off the bone, melted into the grasp of Arab war bands, end quote. When captured by the Muslim horde, Christians and Jews were to pay a tax and submit to their Arab conquerors. The tax was a sign of their inferiority. The Muslims repudiated much of Christian teaching, including and especially the idea that Jesus had been crucified. The Muslims said, and say to this day, the suffering ascribed to Jesus was an error made by the biblical writers. Jesus had not so died. The Muslims also repudiated the Pauline teaching that God has written his commandments on the heart. This idea made Christianity irrevocably different from Islam, as well as Judaism, and I might add as well as essentially every other religion that has ever existed on earth. While Christianity was being driven from the Middle East and North Africa forever, it was expanding in Northern Europe, and Holland devotes a section of the growth of Christianity in England and the remarkable career of a man known to history as the Venerable Bede. Bede made many contributions to Christianity, none greater than his redefinition of time. He said, quote, "There was only one fixed point amid the great sweep of the eons," end quote. So he fixed the hinge of history on the Incarnation. It was a rendering of time itself as properly Christian. Then comes a turning point in history, the Battle of Tours, sometimes called the Battle of Poitiers, in 732 in what is modern France. The Muslims had been advancing all across southern Europe, but that advance ended at the hands of the king of the Franks, Charles the Hammer. Holland says, quote, "More had hung in the balance at Poitiers than the Franks could possibly have realized," end quote. The Muslims had decisively repudiated the conviction that God's true law was written on the hearts of men. Holland says that at stake at Poitiers was nothing less than the legacy of St. Paul. The Franks won the battle and permanently ended the Muslim advance. But this was also the end of the ancient world. Chapter 8 is entitled Conversion, AD 754. In this chapter, Holland begins a new section in Dominion. The first 7 chapters he labeled Antiquity. This section and the next 6 chapters he labels Christendom. One of the more astonishing developments, to me anyway, was the contempt Roman Christians in the 4th century had to missions. Yes, you heard that right. Roman Christians had contempt for missions. Augustine took the Great Commission seriously, but hardly any of his contemporaries did. They regarded Christianity as far too precious to be shared with the savages who lurked beyond the limits of Roman power. Many in the modern church opposed missions, but they were not the first to do so. The Christians in the Roman Empire in 400 AD had no interest in reaching the lost beyond their borders. What came to be known as the barbarian conversion was not a missionary vision of civilized Roman Christians of the Mediterranean. It came roaring out of the far reaches of the former empire, from Ireland and England. Their inhabitants did not see their fellow barbarians as repulsive creatures to be avoided, but as creations of God, living in darkness and in desperate need of light. And light they provided. Holland gives us the example of Boniface, a West Saxon, a British tribe that had only recently been brought to Christ. Quote, "He suffered no anxiety in contemplating the world turned upside down." Quote, and just like the Bereans in Acts 17. We turn next to Charlemagne and the program of empire building, Christian style. As a program for bringing an entire pagan people to Christ, it was as savage as none had ever been before. End quote. Charlemagne believed in forcing Christian culture onto conquered peoples. His strongest criticism came from his own court, his own priest. Alcuin, a disciple of Boniface, condemned the emperor's policy. He said, quote, "Faith arises from the will, not from compulsion. Pagans should be persuaded, not forced to convert." End of quote. I had a student one time tell me that she was bothered by all the forced conversions in the history of Christianity. And I told her, there has never been a true conversion to Christ that was forced in the history of the world. In response, Charlemagne embarked on a serious program of education. Holland says, quote, "How could God's law be written on the hearts of Christian people if they were not properly Christian? Without education, they were doomed." End of quote. At this time, you see Christianity beginning to dominate the educational world, just as we do to this day. Holland describes the devastation of the pagan invasions, Huns and Vikings, but a remarkable thing happened. For the most part, they converted to Christianity. This laid the ground for even greater Christian revolutions occurring after the celebration of the first millennium of Christ's reign on earth. In our next video, we look at the expansion of Christian culture as it becomes the most powerful in world history.